They rewrote our minds. She rewrote their frequency. The first thing Mara Vasek noticed was that Corporal Idris Osi had stacked the chairs, not moved them. Stacked them. All 8 of them from the common mess table, balanced in a perfect spire that reached nearly to the low ceiling of Relay Station Vostok-3. Their legs interlocked with the kind of geometric precision that a human being would need a diagram and 20 quiet minutes to achieve. Oshi was standing 3 meters away when she walked in, his back to her, staring at the wall through the porthole. The stars outside were very still. "Oshi," she said. He turned. His eyes were normal. His expression was what she would later describe in her report as politely absent, the way a man looks when he has walked into a room and forgotten why. "Did you stack those chairs?" she asked. He looked at the tower. He looked at his hands. "I don't know," he said, and he meant it. She could tell. Mara filed the incident under stress. The station was on its 14th month of a scheduled 8-month rotation. The Governance Council's supply lines had been disrupted twice. She was a communications officer, not a psychologist, and she had a job to do. Keep the deep array antennas aimed, keep the signal logs clean, keep the 31 personnel of Vostok-3 in contact with the relay network that connected humanity's 17 outer colony stations to each other across 400 million kilometers of nothing. She did not file a report to the council. This was her first mistake. The second thing she noticed was the interference pattern. It showed up 3 nights later in the carrier wave logs, a rhythmic intrusion in the 2.4 GHz band that her monitoring software flagged as equipment fault. She almost cleared it. Something made her save the raw file first. Professional habit, the same reflex that had kept her logs impeccable for 14 years. She labeled the file Anomaly 01 and set it aside. By the time she got back to it, there were 6 more files. The pattern was not random noise. She could see that within 40 seconds of opening the waveform display and actually looking at it, it was structured. It repeated with a period of approximately 19 minutes, and the amplitude modulation within each repetition was complex, layered, the kind of signal that required intent. The kind that required a transmitter, she called Dov Reitman. Dov was the station's resident xenobiologist, which, at Vostok-3, meant he spent most of his time cataloging microorganism samples from the nearby ice moon and arguing with the council's bureaucrats about why they hadn't sent a proper spectrometer. He was also the only person on the station who had spent time at the Threshold Institute before being reassigned to field work, which meant he was, to Mara's knowledge, the person currently on Vostok-3 who had actually studied the Keth. She showed him the waveform. He was quiet for a long time. "That's not a fault pattern," he finally said. "I know it's not a fault pattern. That's..." He stopped. He pulled up his own display and overlaid something from a file she hadn't seen before. A dense page of waveform diagrams with the Threshold Institute's triple ring watermark in the corner. The match was not perfect, but it was close enough to make her mouth go dry. "That's a Keth carrier encoding," he said, "or something functionally identical to one." "From where?" she said. "The Keth are in the Kepler belt. That's 8 light weeks from here. I know where the Keth are." He said it gently, the way you say something to someone who needs the sentence to be gentle. "I also know what this encoding is used for." She waited. The Threshold Xenolinguistics team called it a resonance imprint. The Keth don't communicate with each other the way we do. They don't send data, they send states, neurological state. When they want to coordinate group behavior, they broadcast a frequency template that their nervous systems just receive it and restructure accordingly. It's not language. It's closer to direct neural overwrite. The chairs, Mara thought. Idris Osi staring at the wall. "How long," she said carefully, "would it take for repeated low-amplitude exposure to produce involuntary behavioral changes in a human being?" Dov looked at her. The color had left his face. "I don't know," he said. "Nobody's ever tested it." "We may already have a dataset," she said, and told him about the chairs. They did not tell the station commander. This was Mara's second mistake, though she would argue to her dying day that it was also the right call. because Commander Paz Delacroix had been spend her evenings rearranging her personal effects in patterns that did not match any organizational logic Mara could identify. The commander's cabin, which Mara had reason to enter twice in the following 72 hours, displayed her books sorted by spine color rather than by author, her tools sorted by weight, her food packets in a spiral on the shelf, smallest to largest, which was not an arrangement a rational human being would arrive at under normal circumstances. Delacroix had been on the station 4 months longer than Mara. They kept the investigation between the two of them. They moved quietly. What they found over the next 6 days was this. The signal had been present in the logs for at least 11 months. The monitoring software had been flagging it as equipment fault the entire time because whatever, was transmitting it had been doing so at precisely the threshold where automated systems would dismiss it as noise. It was not an accident. The frequency had been tuned. Someone understood exactly how Vostok-3's monitoring software worked, exactly where its blind spots were, and had parked an 11-month continuous broadcast directly inside them. The behavioral effects were cumulative and progressive. OC at 14 months exposure was stacking chairs and forgetting why. Delacroix, at 18 months, had begun to organize her environment in geometric patterns she could not explain. 2 other long-tenure crew members had been logging erratic behavior in their own personal diaries. Mara read the fragments they hadn't deleted, describing the sensation of moving their hands and not quite recognizing them as their own. The Keth were rewriting her crew. They were doing it slowly, surgically, from somewhere Mara could not locate. The signal's origin triangulated to a point roughly 40 kilometers below the surface of the ice moon that Dov catalogued samples from. The same ice moon that the Council had flagged 3 years ago as a potential site for a mining operation had sent survey probes to, and then quietly shelved as economically non-viable. The probes had found ice. They had also found, according to Dov's access of the raw survey data, access that required 3 separate authorization overrides and left tracks she could not erase. A dense network of subsurface tunnels and structural regularity that the survey AI had classified as possible geological formation. It was not geological. "They were here before us," Dov said. He was not frightened when he said it. He was precise. A scientist identifying a variable. "They've been here for, we don't know, a long time. The station was placed here because it has good triangulation angles for the deep array. Nobody checked what was under the moon." "Nobody thought to check," Mara said. "Nobody thought there was anything to check." He paused. "The resonance imprint doesn't require line of sight. It goes through ice just fine. 40 kilometers of ice is not a barrier. Can we block it?" He thought about it for a long time. The Threshold team developed a theoretical countermodulation when they were studying the encoding. The idea was that if you broadcast an anti-phase carrier at sufficient power, you create a null zone. The resonance can't propagate inside the null. He hesitated. "We never tested it. We didn't have a transmitter strong enough. The theory was you'd need something like a deep array antenna running at full gain." Mara looked at him. He looked at the ceiling. The deep array antennas, 37 dishes, each 4 meters across, the primary communications infrastructure of Vostok-3, the reason the station existed. They were built to aim at distant stars, not at ice moons 40 kilometers away. They were built to receive, not to transmit at high gain. They were not built for this. None of that meant it was impossible. She spent 31 hours straight at her console. She did not sleep. She drank coffee from a thermos that Dov kept refilling without being asked, and she worked through the antenna control software with the focused, methodical patience that had made her the best comm officer in the outer relay network, the one that 3 separate postings had tried to poach from her current assignment before she'd accepted Vostok-3 on the condition that they gave her full upgrade to the array management system. They had given her the upgrade. It occurred to her, somewhere around the 22nd hour, that she might be singing. She became aware of it when Dov glanced at her and then looked quickly away, and she realized she had been humming something under her breath for an indeterminate period. Her mother's song, an old Moravian thing, no particular melody, the kind of shapeless tune that lives in the back of the throat and means nothing except that it was always there in the kitchen when Mara was small, and the windows were fogged with winter. She kept humming. It helped her think. The problem was power. The deep array dishes could be reconfigured to transmit. It was in the software, buried under 5 layers of permission locks, because nobody was ever supposed to do it. Because transmitting at full gain from a close-quarters target would blow out the antenna calibration systems and require a complete re-zero that took 4 days and a specialized. It would also require a power draw that would take the station's tertiary systems offline. Life support would stay up, heat would stay up. Everything else, labs, secondary comms, Dov's spectrometer arguments, the coffee maker, would go dark. She would have one chance, because the crew was already compromised. Not Dov, 4 months was not enough. Not Mara. She had arrived 8 months ago, and the exposure had apparently not yet reached whatever threshold triggered the gross behavioral effects, though she could not rule out subtler changes she wasn't aware of. But the moment she started redirecting antenna power and pulling tertiary systems, every other alert on the station would light up, and Delacroix would respond to them. And Delacroix was 31 months in. She would have the time between the first alert and Delacroix reaching her console. Maybe 4 minutes, maybe 5. I need you to run interference, she told Dov. Define interference, he said. Occupy the commander physically if necessary. I know you don't want to. I know, Paz Delacroix, he said. She's a good officer. She's not gone. Whatever it's doing to her, she's still in there. I know. That's why I'm trying to do this instead of the other thing. The other thing was what happened if they couldn't stop the broadcast. The other thing was what the Keth were building toward patiently, month by month, in the crew of Vostok-3. Whatever a Keth resonance imprint looked like at 31 months, at 40 months, at 2 years. A station full of human bodies operating under Keth behavioral templates, maintaining the relay network, sending signals, not raising alarms. A quiet acquisition, no violence required. She thought about that. She thought about Osei's hands, the chairs, his honest bafflement, the way he'd said I don't know and meant it, the way his own actions had become illegible to him. She thought about what it felt like to look at your own hands and not quite recognize them. She filed that thought in the same place she was keeping her fear and got back to work. At hour 31, she had the counter-modulation carrier built and loaded into the transmit queue. The anti-phase encoding matched the Threshold Institute's theoretical model as closely as she could construct it from Dov's archived files, and her own extrapolation. She had run the math 4 times. The null zone, if the theory was correct, would propagate through 40 kilometers of ice and disrupt the Keth array's ability to maintain the resonance imprint inside the station's hull. If the theory was correct, she had also found something else. It had taken her until hour 28 to locate, buried in the survey data under 3 layers of geological notation. The structural mapping of the subsurface tunnels had been detailed enough that the Surte AI had actually traced the power routing of the Keth installation. The resonance transmitter was not a single unit. It was a distributed array, 14 emitters spread across a 4-kilometer underground grid, all feeding into a central node. The central node was what maintained coherence. Without coherence, the distributed emitters could still produce noise, but not a structured resonance imprint. Not a clean, targeted, 11-month neurological rewrite. She had the coordinates of the central node. She had, if she angled 3 of the deep array dishes at the right elevation and focused them to a tight beam rather than broadcast, enough transmit power to do more than create a null zone inside the station. Enough to destroy the node. She sat with that for a long time, not because she was unwilling, because it was a decision that deserved 30 seconds of sitting with. She was a communications officer. She had never deployed a weapon in her career. She was not deployed as a weapon. She was 30 years old. She had been humming her mother's song for 11 hours, and she was sitting in a communications chair in a relay station in the dark of the outer system, and the choice in front of her was between a surgical disruption that might not hold and a terminal one that would. She thought about the crew. She thought about the 17 stations in the relay network, each of them with their own deep array, each of them theoretically within range of a Keth installation nobody had found yet. She thought about what the Keth were actually doing here. Not an invasion, not a war. Something quieter and more patient than either of those things, a slow repositioning of human behavior from the inside, the kind of thing that doesn't look like a threat until it's already done. She thought about Idris Osei looking at his own hands. She made the decision. Now, she told Dov, he was already moving. She heard him in the corridor, his voice, calm and professional. Paz, I need you to look at something in the lab. The spectrometer's throwing an error I can't account for, and Delacroix's voice, responding, unhurried, in the tone of a competent officer who had nothing to be alarmed about because everything was normal and orderly, and arranged in the correct geometric patterns. Mara pulled the tertiary power. The station went half dark. The coffee maker died. The lab systems went offline. Dov's spectrometer ironically went with them. She had 4 minutes. The antenna array came to life in her display, all 37 dishes pivoting, their motors running on primary power, the sound of it a low mechanical thunder that she felt more than heard. She pulled 3 of them off their celestial coordinates and aimed them down, toward the ice moon, toward a specific grid point 40 kilometers below the surface that she had marked with a red circle 6 hours ago and had not looked away from since. She loaded the counter-modulation carrier to the broadcast dishes, insurance. The null zone would protect the crew while the rest played out. She loaded the tight beam sequence to the 3 aimed dishes. She thought about her mother's kitchen. She thought about fogged windows and the smell of coffee and the particular quality of winter light in Brno, which was a grey-gold color that she had not seen in 8 months and would not see again for another 14. She thought about Idris Osei, who had stacked chairs without knowing why, who had looked at his own hands and said, "I don't know," and meant it. She hit transmit. The power draw spiked. The monitoring system screamed. 3 dishes and the full broadcast array fired simultaneously, drawing from the primary reserve in a surge that she had calculated to within 3%, she hoped, of what the system could handle before the overload protections kicked in. She heard Delacroix in the corridor, running. Mara did not look up. 40 kilometers of ice. A 4-kilometer grid of Keth technology that had been sitting under a moon for God knew how long, patient, precise, and utterly certain that the creatures on the station above them would never look down. The central node, which was the coherence engine of the entire installation, receiving in the space of 0.3 seconds a focused transmission at a frequency it had never been designed to encounter, because why would anyone have designed against it? Because why would the creatures with the clever tools and the small round radio dishes ever figure out how to use them for this? The monitoring system stopped screaming. Not because Delacroix had pulled the plug, because the signal in the 2.4 gigahertz band, the one that had been present in the logs for 11 months, the one that her software had been calling equipment fault, the one that had been quietly rearranging the minds of her crew for over a year, stopped. Just stopped. It stopped the way a held breath stops, all at once, with the quality of an absence that you only recognize because something that was always there suddenly isn't. Mara sat in the half-dark and listened to the station breathe. The door opened. Delacroix stood in the frame. Her expression was not the politely absent look that Mara had been dreading. It was not geometric. It was sharp and present and very, very confused. "Vasek," she said, "what did you just do to my antenna array?" Mara turned to face her. "Sit down," she said. "I have a report for you. It's going to take a while." The council's investigation team arrived 19 days later. They brought a xenolinguistics specialist from the Threshold Institute and 4 engineers who spent 6 weeks drilling access shafts into the ice moon. What they found 40 kilometers down was consistent with what Dov's data had suggested. A Keth installation of uncertain age partially collapsed in the area around the central node, which was no longer functional. The resonance imprint technology, the xenolinguist confirmed, was precisely what the Threshold team had theorized. The anti-phase counter-modulation that Mara had broadcast across the station had worked as the theory predicted. The crew of Vostok-3, all 31 personnel including Paz Delacroix, tested clean within 11 days of the broadcast. The behavioral changes were reversed. Idris Osi's sleep logs normalized. He stopped reorganizing things he hadn't decided to reorganize. He did not remember stacking the chairs, even when Mara described it to him in detail. He listened with the expression of a man hearing about something that happened to someone else. Then he was quiet for a moment. "Did it hurt?" he asked. "When you fired the array." "For the people down there." Mara thought about how to answer that. The Keth installation had been unmanned. No biological signatures, just machinery, ancient and precise. The central node's destruction had been a hardware event, not a casualty event. She knew that. She had checked. "No," she said. "There was nobody down there." He nodded. He didn't seem entirely satisfied by the answer. She wasn't entirely satisfied by it either, and she thought that was probably correct. A weapons decision was a weapons decision, even when the target was a machine, even when it was the right call. The weight of it belonged to her. She didn't mind that. It was the appropriate distribution. The Council Review classified her actions as justified extraordinary measures under imminent threat conditions and noted in their formal assessment that her counter-modulation approach had preserved all station personnel without fatalities. A result that, the review board chairwoman observed, no military protocol would achieved in the same time frame, because no military protocol had ever anticipated this particular scenario. Nobody had ever anticipated this particular scenario. That was the thing about humans, the xenolinguist told Dov, over coffee in the station mess on the 3rd day of the investigation. They had been studying the Keth for 6 years. The Keth operated on timescales of centuries. Their patience was not a tactic, it was a cognitive mode. They did not encounter resistance because the species they encountered did not historically identify what was being done to them in time to do anything about it. "What changed?" Dov asked. The xenolinguist thought about it. "She kept her raw data files," she said finally. "She almost cleared the fault flag and she didn't. She saved a file instead." Dov nodded. "Professional habit." "Professional habit," the xenolinguist agreed. 14 years of keeping impeccable logs. Not because she suspected anything, just because that's who she is. She wrapped her hands around her coffee. "The Keth have been operating this installation for, our best estimate is 40 years. It's been broadcasting at that frequency since before this station was built. They were ready for us. They modeled us. They had our monitoring software's blind spots mapped before we ever arrived. But they didn't model the coffee thermos," Dov said. She looked at him. "She worked for 31 hours, he said. I kept her thermos full. She kept humming. I don't think she even knew she was doing it." He paused. "They modeled a communications officer. They didn't model that specific communications officer drinking bad coffee and humming her mother's song at 2 in the morning. He was quiet for a moment. "You can't model that. You'd have to model every mother's kitchen, every winter window. You'd have to model what it means to be a particular person who came from a particular place and carries a particular tune in the back of their throat." He picked up his own cup. "I don't think you can do that from 40 kilometers under the ice." The xenolinguist didn't say anything. She wrote something in her notes. Mara was at her console when the final report transmitted successfully to the Council Relay network. She watched the signal handshake propagate down the chain of stations. Vostok-3 to Relay 7 to the inner network hub, clean and confirmed, the way it always was when her equipment was working correctly. The deep array dishes were back on their celestial coordinates. The Re-Zero had taken 4 days and a specialist flown in from Kepler Station. The antenna calibration system had needed 3 replaced components and a full software reset. The coffee maker had survived. The thermos had survived. Idris OC appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs. "Heard the transmission went through," he said. "Confirmed at 084, she said. He handed her a mug. "You going to put in for reassignment?" She looked at her display. The stars outside the porthole were still. They were always still. That wasn't a problem. That was just space, being the enormous and indifferent thing it was, full of signals she hadn't found yet, full of blank spots in the monitoring software she hadn't identified yet, full of patient things under ice moons that she had not yet thought to look for. She had already submitted a proposal to the Council's Survey Committee for a systematic deep scan protocol across all 17 relay station ice bodies within collection range. They had responded with a form letter about resource allocation. She would send it again. "No," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Ozzy nodded. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at the porthole, at the stars that were very still, and he did not look like a man looking at something alien. He looked like a man looking at a problem he hadn't solved yet. "Good," he said. Outside, the stars held their positions. The ice moon turned slowly in the dark. 40 kilometers below its surface, in a grid of tunnels that no human had yet entered, something that had been patient for 40 years was now very quiet. Above it, a woman drank bad coffee and kept her logs clean and waited to see what the silence would do next.